You won't believe how this small group of Russian soldiers in World War I managed to defend the Osowek fortress in Poland. It's one of the most incredible and inspiring war stories you could ever hear. Without further talk, let's dive into this incredible story. On August 3rd, 1915, during World War I, there was a 21-year-old Russian soldier named Vladimir Kotlinski. He was looking out from behind the massive stone walls of the Osowek fortress in Poland. He was gazing at the same scenery he had been seeing for the past 6 months. Surrounding the fortress was a large forest that enveloped it from all sides. The forest was filled with swamps. In addition to this, the fortress was surrounded by dozens of trenches, which were deep and long holes dug by soldiers to hide in when under attack, and from which they launched their own attacks against the enemy, while being protected by the earthen walls of the trenches. A network of these winding trenches was established around the Osowek fortress, which were later occupied by the Germans during their fights with the Russians in World War I. The Germans were desperate to take control of Osowek fortress from the Russians because it was in a strategically crucial location, with a railway line passing through and a river nearby. Controlling the fortress would significantly assist in transporting supplies, ammunition, and equipment during the war. Despite repeated attempts by the 7,000 German soldiers to take control of the Osowek fortress over the past 6 months, they were repelled by Vladimir and the small Russian force of 900 soldiers inside the fortress. On the morning of August 3rd, 1915, as Vladimir was observing the German soldiers in the trenches and following the skirmishes between them and the Germans, it seemed like the battles had reached a stalemate. Neither side was trying to attack the other, nor did either side want to leave their positions. Both were sitting in their spots, doing nothing. Out of sheer boredom, the Russian soldiers hiding inside the fortress would sneak out from the back gate to the river to catch fish with their hands and bring them back to the fortress. However, on that particular morning, Vladimir noticed something strange happening in one of the trenches near the river. This trench was about 100 meters away from the fortress, but from his vantage point, Vladimir could clearly see what was happening inside it. He saw a group of high-ranking German officers gathered together, looking down at the ground inside the trench. Vladimir had no idea what they were looking at in the trench. The trench appeared empty from his view. Then the German officers would look up at the sky, wave their hands in strange motions, and then look back down at the ground. Vladimir had no idea why they were doing this. When he looked up at the sky where they were gesturing, he saw nothing, just a normal blue sky. Whatever the German officers were doing, it made Vladimir nervous. Vladimir was a young junior officer responsible for the soldiers under his command. But since he was new, he lacked sufficient experience in warfare. Therefore, he wasn't considered a major leader in the army. That's why, when Vladimir saw these strange movements by the Germans, he felt anxious and unsure of what to do. Should he leave his place to report to his superiors that he saw the Germans looking at the ground and gesturing at the sky? He felt that if he reported what he saw, he would be laughed at and ridiculed. So he stayed in his place, watching the Germans as they performed these strange actions. He thought to himself, "Why am I worried? As long as no one has fired at us, there is no attack. Whatever the Germans are doing, it has no significance." He came down from the fortress where he had been watching the Germans, dismissed what he had seen, and went inside to talk with his comrades about other things. 3 days later, at 4 a.m., the Russian soldiers on guard around the fortress walls noticed something strange happening in the darkness around them. They saw the outline of the forest and trees shaking in front of their eyes. Let me give you an example. Imagine the griddle in a restaurant where they grill fish. If you look at it, you'll see the image you perceive with your eyes shaking around that intensely hot grill. Or like the hot air you see rising above the asphalt on a very hot summer day. You see the asphalt appearing to dance and ripple from the heat in front of your eyes. That's exactly what the Russian soldiers were seeing. Their surroundings looked blurry and wavy in this way, but of course it wasn't due to the sun's heat at that time of dawn. The Russians didn't know what to do about this mysterious fog, so they began summoning more soldiers to see what this strange thing was. Within the next couple of minutes, as the Russian soldiers observed the fog from behind the castle walls, they realized what it was. The fog was moving toward them like a cloud, but it was on the ground. It had a grayish-green color and was enormous as the size of the castle they were in. The wind was pushing this cloud in their direction, towards the castle. The Russian soldiers had no idea what was coming toward them. All they did was stand and watch in silence and amazement. As soon as this cloud touched any plant or grass growing from the swamp, the grass would turn black and wither quickly. The Russian soldiers began hearing strange thumping noises within the cloud. It turned out that these thumping sounds were the noises of birds dying and falling to the ground inside this cloud. At this point, the Russian soldiers began to panic and summoned the rest of their comrades in preparation for an attack. They started to smell the deadly chemical odor that had entered the castle. After a while, they began to hear their comrades coughing violently. What happened explained the strange movements the German officers had been making when Vladimir was watching them, puzzled by why they were looking at the ground, then at the sky, and then back at the ground. It turned out they were preparing for a chemical attack on the Osovec fortress. They had placed canisters or batteries of poisonous gas in the trenches, and when the officers raised their hands in the air, they were measuring if the wind was strong enough and in the right direction to launch the attack. For the past 3 days, the wind had not been in their favor. But on this day, August 6th, 1915, at 4 in the morning, the wind was in their favor, and they released the gas. This gas was among the worst that any soldier could be exposed to. It was a mixture of chlorine gas and bromine gas, both of which are highly toxic and potentially lethal. Imagine how much more dangerous they became when combined. Upon exposure to water vapor or humidity in the air, this mixture turns into hydrochloric acid. This means that if this gas touches anyone not wearing a mask or protective gear, the moment they inhale it, their lungs would fill with acid, causing them to disintegrate from the inside out. The gas would enter their eyes and nostrils, and the acid would bore holes into their skulls. Once your body comes into contact with this gas, no one can do anything to save you. You will die, but very slowly and painfully, a prolonged agony. At this stage in world wars, humanity did not yet understand anything about chemical weapons, and no one had used them in any war before. The Germans were the first to invent this weapon. This is why the Russian army had not equipped its soldiers with masks to protect against poisonous gases. However, the Germans were aware of this and had prepared by wearing protective masks. The deadly poisonous gas began to permeate every inch of the Ossowiec fortress. Immediately, the soldiers started bleeding from their eyes, mouths, ears, and noses, coughing and vomiting pieces of their lungs. The Russians inside the fortress quickly realized they had been poisoned. Soldiers who had not yet been directly affected by the gas. Upon seeing their comrades suffering, they started tearing off their clothes, soaking them in water, and wrapping them around their mouths and noses like makeshift masks. But honestly, this temporary solution they came up with didn't solve the problem. It made things even worse. The gas would react with the moisture or water on the cloth, meaning these Russian soldiers were effectively sentenced to death. Meanwhile, outside the castle walls, the Germans, wearing masks and holding their weapons, launched their attack. Inside the fortress, the Russians were dying with nowhere to escape. At this time, Vladimir was still standing and holding his ground inside the fortress. He looked through a small window in the castle wall and saw the Germans outside running towards them, wielding their rifles and firing them randomly at the fortress. At that moment, Vladimir knew that as soon as the Germans crossed the main gate of the fortress, they would eliminate all the Russians with their rifles. However, Vladimir's reaction wasn't one of fear or sadness. Instead, his resolve grew stronger, and he said, "If they are coming to kill us, it won't be easy. They must pay a high price." Vladimir was known for never being a coward. Over the past 6 months, when the fortress was under siege by the German army in their trenches, during any battle that broke out between them, Vladimir was always the first to run and be in the front line of combat. Whenever one of his comrades was injured in battle, Vladimir would crawl on the ground to pull the wounded soldier to safety for first aid. He had a natural instinct for fighting. The German soldiers were approaching the fortress despite the shells that Vladimir and his soldiers were firing at them. As the Germans continued to advance towards the fortress's artillery, Vladimir left the window where he had been firing at the German forces. He entered the courtyard. In the middle of the fortress, in that courtyard, were hundreds of Russian soldiers who were still alive, even though they had been poisoned by the gas and were just moments away from death. But they were still standing on their feet. Vladimir approached them, and despite being young, he stood before them and shouted with all his determination, This is the moment when we will all die. But what we do now is what will be written in our history. Those words that Vladimir said to the soldiers who had resigned themselves to death greatly boosted their morale, despite bleeding from their eyes and mouths and coughing up pieces of their lungs. They were filled with a renewed sense of courage and determination. Suddenly, all the Russian soldiers opened the fortress gates and rushed out with their weapons to confront the Germans. They charged at the Germans, screaming terrifyingly, armed with their weapons. The Germans had expected that the chemical attack would wipe out all the Russian soldiers and that they would take over the Osovec fortress with ease, believing all the Russians would be dead, but they hadn't expected the fortress gates to swing wide open. Releasing the Russians, their faces wrapped in blood-soaked rags, vomiting pieces of their internal organs, they staggered left and right, just like zombies or the undead, wielding their weapons and screaming like demons. The Germans saw this sight and were so terrified they almost lost control of themselves and retreated in fear back to their trenches. Vladimir and his soldiers started eliminating the Germans one by one. But after Vladimir and his zombie army ran out of ammunition, they continued advancing through the thousands of German soldiers. They picked up the weapons from the dead German soldiers on the ground and attacked the remaining Germans with them until they reached the trenches where the retreating Germans had taken refuge. Hiding and afraid of the undead army, in front of these trenches, there was a barbed wire fence. The Germans, in their sheer terror, kept looking over their shoulders as they ran, not noticing the path ahead and running straight into the barbed wire, getting entangled. Vladimir and his zombie army finished off the Germans trapped in the barbed wire with the bayonets on their rifles. While Vladimir was doing this, a German soldier saw him and stabbed him in the abdomen with his bayonet. Vladimir took the stab without moving or uttering a sound. He looked at the bayonet in his stomach, then at the German soldier who was still holding the rifle with the bayonet lodged in Vladimir's abdomen. The German soldier was staring at Vladimir, holding the rifle with the bayonet, trembling with fear. Vladimir then screamed in his face, coughed up blood, and spat out parts of his lungs and covered the German soldier's face with blood. The German soldier panicked, dropped his weapon, and ran back in terror from Vladimir. Vladimir then grabbed his own weapon and finished off the remaining Germans as if nothing had happened to him. The Germans fled, abandoning the battle, terrified of the zombie army that had launched a counterattack against them. Although the Germans outnumbered the remaining Russians, who were still alive, by 70 times, they failed to capture the Osovec fortress. The Germans, who survived the counterattack and returned to their trenches, reported to their comrades that the Russians had literally turned into zombies or undead. They believed that any attack on them would be futile because they were already dead. This belief led to such fear that the Germans were too afraid to leave their trenches. Once the Russians had successfully repelled the German attack, Vladimir was still alive at that moment. The bayonet was still lodged in his abdomen. He called on the remaining soldiers to retreat and return to the fortress. So, The small group of the zombie army soldiers, swaying as they walked, obeyed the order and returned to their fortress. At this point, Vladimir gave them the final order to destroy the fortress, following a scorched earth policy. If this place is to be taken by the enemy, then it will be of no use to anyone. By then, the gas had killed all the Russian soldiers who had been exposed to it, including Vladimir. When the Germans eventually entered and took over the fortress, they found it severely destroyed from the inside and of no strategic value. All the effort and sacrifices made by the Germans during the 6-month siege of the fortress had been in vain, because the fortress was no longer of any use. Vladimir was posthumously awarded Russia's highest military honor, and this battle became a story told in songs, with monuments erected in his honor throughout Russia. Thank you for watching. If our story gave you goosebumps, give us a like. Join our dark community by subscribing for more sinister tales. Until then, keep your senses sharp and sleep with one eye open.